So, oh, that too, I gotta do that. Right, I did got it on my. Okay. Yes, okay, love it. So, are we going?
Well, so maybe want to look to see if people are coming in.
Yes.
Okay.
How do I see Andrew, Funmi, someone here? Yes, she's right here. Wave your hand.
Oh, you can't see it. Yeah, so we have 17%.
Yeah, you can put your
Camera on.
you can leave your camera on and then leave your volume off. So then there she is.
Can somebody give me co-sharing capabilities, please?
Can you do that or
Yeah,
do I
I'll
need
just
to
do
do that?
Yeah, I'll do it once we unshare.
Okay. Yeah,
Let me
she's
call
sharing-
so I can share it. I just want to test the sharing screen
co-host though, or
before we start.
Okay.
Just a quick check, please.
We're ready to go.
We're ready to go. Well, thank you everyone for being here, both online and in person. I'm really honored, although I don't think I deserve the honor, to be chairing or moderating this really interesting and important panel about a very important book, which I already knew about and had read, so I was very excited to be able to be a part of discussing it. The title of this talk and this meeting is Thieving the Present, Building the Future, a roundtable discussion with Funmi Arewa from Temple University. And the book we'll be discussing is her recent book, Disrupting, I have the book open to the other page. Disrupting Africa, Technology, Law, and Development. And it's a really interesting and powerful book, particularly for those of us who are both historians, but also work in the present day in Africa. So I hope everyone will not only enjoy this presentation, but whether you're here or whether you're online, you will buy the book and read it, because I think it's a book that's breaking a lot of new ground in how we do scholarship today, how we bring together history and law, how we bring together ideas of culture and political economy, how we think about the ongoing effects of colonialism in the present moment, especially now that we have more and more people focusing on what is called decolonial studies, so much of which is focused on a Latin American context, to actually see how it can be applied really powerfully in an African context, and then to see the differences between Latin American experiences and African experiences of colonialism and the way it shapes culture, politics, political economy. It's just really important. So for so many reasons, this is a really important book, and I'm really happy when we came back to visit us to talk about this book, although we're all sad she left to begin with. But let me start, before we get into the subject of the talk, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. Having just come back from Australia, working with a bunch of Indigenous Aboriginal scholars there, I've developed a new appreciation for this idea of doing land acknowledgements, but also at the importance of going much further than how we normally do them. So I want to start off by reminding us that we are all living, working, and moving through unceded territory in California, which is home to nearly 200 tribal nations, with the tribes of the Shoshonean family particularly prominent in Southern California, especially the Tongva, the Juaneño, and the Luiseño, all of whom were on this territory before the Spanish began colonizing it in the late 1700s. I hope we will remember that this land was ripped away from the indigenous peoples by multiple successive empires, first the Spanish, then the Mexican, then the US American governments, along with, of course, the Catholic Church, various missions, ranchers, businessmen, oilmen, corporations, all of whom were interested in the fertile soil and the water and oil beneath it over the course of the last half millennium. These steps started a process which is tied directly to the historic drought in which we are now living, and so many of the other disasters that are plaguing not just this state and not just this country, but also this planet. I hope we'll further acknowledge that acknowledgement is only the first step, and that it must be followed by repair. Not just reparations, but repairing the rift between peoples that has been at the heart of the violence of colonization, capitalism, nationalism, and their commingling, and which continues to the present day. We understand that the violence and pain inflicted upon indigenous peoples ultimately is sustained by humanity as a whole, whether it is the First Nations in North America, indigenous Aboriginal peoples globally, or the colonized and enslaved peoples of Africa and their descendants and diasporas. But first and foremost, let us acknowledge that at this moment we are on stolen land. I hope we can work with Native communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. And let's take a moment before we start to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon, and support the resilience and strength of all the indigenous people that they have shown worldwide. So let me start by just introducing everyone who's here today. First, to my immediate left, Olufunmilayo Arewa is the Murray Shusterman Professor of Transactional and Business Law at Temple University School of Law, where she teaches corporate governance. Prior to becoming a law professor, she worked for close to a decade in business and legal capacities at law firms, technology startups, and venture capital. Professor Arewa is the author of course, the book we're talking about today, Disrupting Africa, Law, Technology, and Development, and winner of the 2022 International Studies Association Science, Technology, and Art in International Relations Award, which is conferred annually for the best book that advances innovative research agendas on the intersections between international relations and politics of science, technology, and art. Professor Arewa received an MA and PhD in anthropology from UC Berkeley, an AM in applied economics from the University of Michigan, a JD from Harvard Law School, and an AD from Harvard College. She sits on the international, gosh, what is that abbreviation stand for? IMTFI's Board Academic Advisory Board. Directly to her left, Yousuf Al-Bulushi teaches in the Department of Global and International Studies at UCI, one of our newest and most cool departments. He's currently completing a manuscript entitled Ruptures in the Afterlife of the Apartheid City. The book explores a movement of Black shack dwellers in the city of Durban, South Africa, as a window into broader continental and global debates regarding precarity, autonomy, transition, and development. He recently published Thinking Racial Capitalism and Black Radicalism from Africa, an intellectual geography of Cedric Robinson's world system in the journal Geoforum. And it is really, really interesting, especially for those of us who love Cedric Robinson, but never really thought about all his time in Africa. So I learned a lot from reading it. To his left, Jessica Milward is the Inclusive Excellence Black Thriving Term Chair at the University of California, Irvine, where she is an associate professor in the Department of History and a core faculty member of African American Studies. An expert on slavery, freedom, and Black women in early America, Dr. Millward's first book, Finding Charity Spoke, Enslaved and Free Black Women in Maryland, was published as part of the Race in the Atlantic World series at the University of Georgia Press. Finally, joining us on Zoom is Professor Sylvester Ofunodu Ogbechie, who is a 2022 Guggenheim Fellow and a professor of art history at UC Santa Barbara. Professor Ogbechie is an expert on the arts and visual culture in Africa and in the diasporas, especially in terms of how art history discourses create value for African cultural patrimony in the age of globalization. Something I'm sure we all are thinking a lot about with all the discussions and debates about returning stolen art, especially from European museums. He is the author of the 2009 Herskovits Prize winner Ben Nwonwu, The Making of an African Modernist, on the University of Rochester Press, which is really one of the best biographies of an artist I've ever read. Making History, the Femi Akinsanya African Art Collection from Milan, the 5 Continents editions. An editor of Artists of Nigeria, also from Milan, from the 5 Continents edition, the director of the Ashram Knowledge Systems, and founder and editor of a really important journal, Critical Interventions, Journal of African Art History and Visual Culture. He organized and coordinated the first international Nollywood convention and symposium in LA in 2005, and is the founder of the Nollywood Foundation to formalize study and research of this phenomenon. So it's a really great honor to have you here and to have all of you here. This is going to be a really, really interesting discussion, and my job is going to be more or less to stay out of the way. So with that in mind, I would like to turn it over to Funmi and give you as much time as you need to just go through what you think some of the most important arguments and ideas you want to give us from the book. And then all three of our co-panelists will have a chance to respond related to their own work. And then after some discussion between everyone, we'll open it up to the crowd. But given that we're doing this in the spirit of music, if anyone is really possessed to ask something or to say something really relevant, feel free. And if it's not that good, I'll give you the look I used to get on stage when I did something really stupid, which is, please don't do that again. But I don't think anyone's gonna do that though. So let's consider this a discussion and have the time. So welcome.
Thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. It's first of all a pleasure to be here and enjoy this weather. The weather here is a lot better than in Philadelphia, where the temperature goes from very cold to very hot, and most of the year is quite unpleasant with lots of pollen. So this is definitely a pleasant place to be because you can spend hours here outside and it's so sunny. So we certainly miss the weather here, as well as many people. So thank you all for coming out today. I want to start out by, I want to first of all thank Tiffany Willoughby Gerard, who was really instrumental in organizing this session and conceptualizing it, but who unfortunately is unable to be with us today. I think her presence is, and her imprint is on the structure of the event. So we're recording it, so she'll be able to see it, but I wanted to definitely highlight that and make sure she knows how valuable her input and contributions were to the event. So we're going to talk about my book, Disrupting Africa, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about the book I'm writing now, which is about commodification in African American music. And it's funny, there are interrelationships between those because they both reflect what I refer to, they reflect something of what I refer to as colonial overhang. And colonial overhang is something that really, I spent 10 years doing archival research for this book. So this book is based to a significant degree on our archival research about colonial lawmaking. The book talks about a lot more than colonial lawmaking, but that was sort of the core resource that got me thinking about what colonialism means in different contexts. And a key thing that I really focus on is the digital era, because when I practiced law, I worked a lot with technology companies. And I think African countries today sit at a crossroads of the past, present, and future. And a lot of the past reflects conditions of colonialism. Colonialism, to a significant degree, disrupted what was there before. And it's not to say that it went away, but it disrupted it in important ways. And I think one of the ways to think about reparation is how do you sort of repair some of the destructive things that happened during colonialism. And you can't necessarily go back to where you were before, but you can get to a place that maybe makes the past, future, and present flow in a little more, with a little less disruption. So that's one thing to think about as you think about what reparation means and what repair means. And I think this crossroads is really highlighted in the digital era, because many people think about the digital era, we tend to be technology optimists. I'm a big geek, I admit it, I love technology. And we often like to think about technology as making things better. And that often is true. I mean, there are many things about the technologies that we see in the room around us that has made the world a better place. By the same token, technologies exist within a context. As a result, there are positive and negative aspects of technology. And in many African contexts, colonial overhang is shaping how technology is being deployed and utilized, particularly by governments. So we see in Nigeria, for instance, in response to the NSARS protests in Nigeria, the Nigerian government has basically been shut down Twitter. It's banned cryptocurrency exchanges. So it's moved cryptocurrency, it has to be peer-to-peer, which is much less secure for people utilizing it. And Nigeria is not the only government that's doing this. The most common internet policy in many African countries today is the internet shutdown. And that's contrary to our assumptions about how technology is connected to progress. So that, I think, is a reflection of colonial overhang. So what I'm going to talk about first is, I'm going to talk about culture, power, and colonialism. Since I also write about music, I talk a lot about culture when I write. And And then I want to talk a little bit about the winner, Kere, who won the Pritzker Prize in March, because I think he offers an important lesson in how we can think about alternative paths to the ones that many African countries are on at present. So in terms of, and then I want to talk about what colonial overhang is, and then I want to hear from the fabulous panelists that we have today. I'm really looking forward to a wonderful discussion. So I want to first of all talk about culture, power, and colonialism. So if we think about slavery and colonialism, I write about the New World and Africa, and I think slavery and colonialism connects these two things. And both of them reflect a constructed worldview that's justified subordination of people of African descent in African contexts and elsewhere. And this worldview continues to impact the shifting terrain of the local and global today. I mean, one of the most interesting things about the Ukraine, the situation in the Ukraine, is how Africans, people of African descent, and also people from South Asia, were not permitted to leave the country. And I've heard different stories about who's responsible. I think there might be joint responsibility. In some instances, it might be people in Ukraine. It might be people in Poland and across borders. But that just reflects attitudes about race that continue to shape the world in ways that, until actually the George Floyd murder, I think many people in the United States denied. I think now there's less denial and there's more acknowledgement of the fact that there is a reality of hierarchies of race and culture that continue to impact how people are received in different contexts. And even if things sort of seem fine, like African students studying in the Ukraine, it seemed fine until people had to escape. And then many of them were actually barred from leaving. And there's some people who have actually died. I know at least one student from India has been killed in the violence in Ukraine. And it's not necessarily Ukraine's fault, because Russia is obviously committing acts of violence. But what can be faulted in people at the border is treating people because they're of their skin differently. And that's a problem. That's an ongoing problem. And it reflects continuing patterns of relationships, and it reflects colonial overhang. And I think I was also struck by the world tour of the Caribbean in March, where we had helicopters trying to land on indigenous lands, that disputed indigenous lands. We had sort of an attempt to sort of paper over some fundamental core problems that are colonial hangovers in terms of the we being the kind of state in many countries. And there are a lot of, and I'm not going to go into too much depth in that because we could spend the entire session talking about that. But it does highlight continuing tensions emerging from British colonial practices in places like the Caribbean and the slave trade, and they're often connected, especially in the New World. So colonial legacy is evident in multiple spheres, including the local and global political spheres, economic, financial, social, religion, and cultural spheres. And this reflects what I call widespread colonial hangover. And I'll start out with religion. One of the things that fascinated me in the research of my book about Africa is the slave Bible. So missionaries went out in Africa and in areas where there were enslaved people in the Caribbean and the United States. The Africans that were brought over forcibly during slavery were not Christian. And they practiced their own religions. And at one point there was missionization efforts. One of the things that's fascinating is the slave Bible was curated. It was curated to take out the parts of the Bible that would incite rebellion, including those involving Moses freeing the Israelites from captivity, and retaining passages that reinforce the institution of slavery. So the omitted passages actually, not surprisingly, included 90% of the Old Testament and 50% of the New Testament, which means that the slave Bible included only 232 of the 1189 chapters in the Standard Protestant Bible. Now, I think the slave Bible is an interesting starting point for our thinking about colonialism and colonial hangover, because the slave Bible was an attempt to exert, to instill a certain worldview about religion in an environment that was colored by political, cultural, and social domination of the slaves. And it shows you that even some of the fundamental core aspects of the civilization that Europeans were bringing were colored and shaped by the desire to dominate. And that's a really important thing for thinking about how colonial overhang continues to operate in cultural spheres. One of the things that's interesting is we see culture used as a mechanism for extraction, but also commentary and protest in various contexts. I discussed borrowing and music extensively in my music scholarship. I'm going to talk about music briefly today, but I want to initially focus on commentary, protest, and extraction. Now, we know music can be a language of protest. And one of the things that's fascinating, drumming was prohibited both by slave owners in the New World and by colonial powers in African contexts. So in the Congo-Brazzaville, a 1904 French colonial decree imposed restrictions on playing drums and dancing during certain hours. And contravention of this decree was punishable by a fine, 1 to 5 days in prison or both. And these bans on drumming were just one example of widespread efforts by colonial authorities to censor musical expression. In slave contexts, fearing use of drums as a means of communication, drumming prohibitions were common aspects of in slave owning areas. There were also prohibitions on things like dancing. So there were all kinds of prohibitions that shaped the cultural lives of people subject to colonialism and people who were enslaved. One of the things that I talk about in the book is in colonial African contexts, colonial takings of art are the subject of continuing contestation, and particularly the Benin bronzes, which were stolen in 1897 in a punitive expedition by the British, who sacked Benin and stole a significant amount of the Benin cultural legacy. And that cultural legacy is now present in museum and private collections throughout the world. Now, some of it is scheduled to be returned perhaps in 2023, but we'll see what actually happens in that. There's been tremendous resistance, and some of the arguments resisting the return of some of both artifacts and art have been absolutely fascinating and quite stunning. I talk about Mwazulu Diabanza, who uses visible and live streamed attempted removals of African art in European museums to draw attention to colonial era theft and exploitation. So he'll go to a museum, he's gone to museums in Paris and museums in the Netherlands, and he'll basically pick up a staff and he'll walk out, he'll just pick it up and walk out of the museum with it, and it's all live streamed, and he's continually giving commentary, so it's a kind of performance art. And then when he gets to the door of the museum, they say you can't take it because of the theft, but he's just sort of illustrated his point, because his whole point is he wants to draw attention to colonial era theft and exploitation. And so they're saying this art that somehow ended up in this museum, if you take it, it's theft, but if we take it, that's an open question. I'm not sure we ever get answers to that. The presence of African art in museums and elsewhere is increasingly a point of contestation, because these takings and refusals for much of the 20th century to return the art encapsulates much about the continuing impact of colonialism. As Dan Hicks notes in his 2020 book, The Brutish Museums, the Benin bronzes, colonial violence and cultural restitution, the bronze plaques and other royal and sacred objects looted from Benin City were no more side effects of empire than palm oil and rubber were side effects of empire. In fact, they form an enduring part of the ecology of militarist colonialism. And as I note in the book, contestation about looting and repatriation are part of a continuing dialogue about past, present, and future, and draw attention to patterns of involvement of the external in Africa. Resolution of contestation about looted art may be an important path to reconciliation of past wrongs and future possibilities. And the report by Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy in 2018 talks about how restitution it involves the recognition of the illegitimacy of the property one had previously claimed ownership of, no matter what the duration of the time was. As a consequence, the act of restitution attempts to put things back in order into proper harmony. To openly speak of restitutions is to speak of justice or rebalancing, recognition of restoration and reparation. But above all, it's a way to open a pathway towards establishing a new cultural relations based on a newly reflected upon ethical relation. And I think part of what my book is searching for is a way to think about new paths that can disrupt the shadows of colonial overhang, and think about how can we think about curating a vision of the past that recognizes that colonialism occurs, but tries to ameliorate the most disruptive aspects of colonialism. In the context of law, that is going to require significant legal reform. In other contexts, it's going to require a new worldview, because in many African contexts, there's what I call a valorization of the external. Things that come from the outside are valued to a greater extent. And this is what Frantz Fanon talked about when he talked about the psychology of colonialism. And it's something that has particularly shaped elite worldviews all over the African continent, and it needs to be thought about and scrutinized a bit more. So debate and dialogue about colonial art taking draws attention to continuing patterns of curation, which involve attempts to reshape or erase the past. And actually, the book I'm writing now is called Curation, Culture, and Black Music, Law and Commodification, which is really about African American music, which obviously has a relationship with Africa. So this is evident in museums all over Europe, where the history of colonialism has been, colonialists always justified colonialism by saying they were bringing civilization to Africa, and that there was the needed civilization they were bringing. That's not actually what they brought. In my research, we suggest they brought many things, but civilization wasn't one of them, unless you define by definition what they do with civilization. Because many of the things they did in African context are inconsistent with any reasonable conception of civilization. And so when you go to museums today, for instance, I was at the Verguin in Berlin 3 or 4 years ago, where a lot of the art, for a lot of complicated reasons, a lot of the been in bronze has ended up in Germany. That's why Germany, even though Germany lost its colonies and after the First World War, Germany is a big part of the discussion about repatriation. And I remember I was wandering through the museum, and you have a lot of modern European art interspersed with random been-in bronzes, and there's no discussion of the context by which those bronzes arrived at the Verguin Museum, or the fact that they were even looted. So it's as if there's these random pieces of artwork from Nigeria that ended up, what's today Nigeria, that ended up in this German museum, and that lack of contextualization shapes continuing attitudes towards colonialism, because colonialism is really seen as probably not being so bad. Well, Africans got a lot of things from colonialism, and I think that misunderstands the disruptive elements of colonialism and the continuing disruption that we see from things that happened that were put in place during the colonial era. So I want to talk briefly about colonialism. And first of all, I want to give a couple of shout outs about culture. We see examples in culture where current paths are not fixed. We see reshaping of cultural understanding. So I'd like to talk about Nollywood. Nollywood film industry today has global content, has global impact. It was started out locally within Nigeria in the context where representations of Africa were largely external. And largely, I remember, in the United States, most people's first contact with Africa was probably a Tarzan movie or something that has very negative images of African people. Nollywood is really important because it and many other local film industries that we're seeing arise all over the African continent give an opportunity for people in local contexts to shape their own representation. So we see that Nollywood has had a global impact from its small origins, and increasingly people from Nollywood are part of the global film scene. In music, we've seen a global impact with musicians like Fela, who pioneered Afrobeat, and lyrics in his famous song, Zombie, reflect an attack on police brutality of Nigerian soldiers that was then utilized by NSAR's protesters in 2020, who used his music to basically protest some of the same things he was talking about 40 years before that point in time. But today we have even very commercially successful artists like Burna Boy, who's probably the most well-known African musician today globally, who won a Grammy, and he brought greater global visibility to NSAR's protest with his song 2010-20. So we're seeing in the cultural sphere, I think people are carving out new paths. The question is, can we think more broadly outside of the cultural sphere? One of my favorite pieces is that there's a 2018 anti-CFA franc rap song. So the CFA franc is CFA franc is a colonial currency, and it's 7 minutes contre le CFA franc, which you can get on YouTube. And it's a really interesting rap song where they're rapping about this colonial currency, colonial mindset currency that 12 former French colonies basically have their currency pegged to the euro. And they actually, at the end of it, they basically say in English, the CFA franc, CFA is not our currency, and then they burn it. So it's a really interesting protest against colonialism. And we're seeing a lot of that in artistic and cultural spheres. And I want to highlight Kere, who won the Pritzker Prize. He shows us that he's the first Black architect and the first architect from Africa to win the Pritzker Prize. He steps out of the shadow of colonial hangover in many respects and presents a new type of potential model for incorporating the local into construction within and buildings within African contexts. And one of my favorite quotes from him, he basically uses indigenous materials and local symbols. For his first building, which was built in his hometown, a school, he actually drew drop blueprints in the sand for people. And he talks about how the success of his building is because you incorporate the local into the buildings. And someone asked him at one point, he was going to build a legislative building in Burkina Faso, and they asked him, well, why don't you want to build a European style building? And he said, because that's not the cultural heritage that we see in Burkina Faso. He said, our local symbol is sort of people meeting under a tree. So he wants to build a building that incorporates that symbolism and that sort of cultural connection. And I think that kind of local connection is really important as we think about how do we disrupt the shadow of colonial hangover. And I just want to briefly talk about colonial hangover as a continuing external and internal impact in many African contexts, and it casts a continuing long shadow that reflects patterns of external domination that had an externalized extractive focus. So originally raw materials during the industrial age, but the digital era hasn't really changed that. Even though we have a lot of dialogue about mobile phones in Africa, in the digital era, it may be rare earth metals, it's things connected to technologies, but it's still the same extractive story. And some of the places like DRC that are a rich source of some of the important things that are digital needed in the digital economy are actually not doing so well today, despite the fact that they have resources that are really important in use in the digital era. We had patterns of external domination that continue till today. We had multiple genocides during colonialism, genocide and wars against Africans whenever Africans posed strong resistance, and that's likely playing to an external audience of other European powers. So the key part about colonialism is that it was external powers largely looking at each other as the key element for thinking about how do we undertake colonialism. So if we look at the Berlin Conference and you go to look at the documents that documented the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, it was basically, there was no involvement of local people, there was no involvement of Africans, it was European countries talking to one another. And a lot of colonialism was about how they interacted with one another and how they used Africa for their own external objectives. Concentration camps, which we know were used widely in World War II, were first used by Germans in Namibia against the Arewa and the Ma. So a lot of practices that we think of as being some of the more horrific practices of the 20th century actually started in African contexts. There were wars against locals who tried to compete commercially or to resist political incorporation. King Jaja in the Niger Deltas just sought to compete against European traders and monopolize export trade to Europe. He wanted to establish himself as an independent exporter, independent of European firms. Colonial officials objected to his competition and they actually deported him to the Caribbean. And one of the things that's really interesting in the journal, that when they were, the Foreign Office journal, when they were talking about his case, they basically say, now they were talking about him, how they were going to deport him. Now they are about to reap the long awaited for and sadly needed profits of their praiseworthy enterprise. Their trade stopped, and that's referring to European traders. Their trade stopped by the machinations of one of the most grasping, unscrupulous, and overbearing of mushroom kings, whoever attempted to throttle the growing commerce of white men with the rich interior. So the idea of colonialism was for external extraction. And you saw that in the data, independence in Nigeria. 95% of the trade in Nigeria was controlled by 0.04% of the population. And that population was all expatriates to a significant degree. So the 99+% of local Nigerian people had little or no involvement in the external trade. And that, when we think about economic and political domination, that's how it happens. And that's how colonialism is structured. In terms of internal impact, colonialism reflects external patterns of domination and extraction, but it also has a continuing internal impact because the majority of the population in many African countries is excluded and marginalized. These people aren't taken into consideration from a policy perspective. They were taken into consideration by the colonial powers who interfaced with selected elites. And they still aren't taken into consideration in many African contexts, unfortunately. So you had the development of elite intermediaries who were an essential part of the structure of colonialism. And these elite intermediaries reflected external selection and validation. One of the most fascinating things in the colonial record in Nigeria is how quickly they disposed of rulers that weren't advantageous to the British. It was like musical chairs. Well, we picked this ruler, he didn't really do good things for us, so we're gonna get this new ruler. So what those rulers were doing internally for local people was not moving their major consideration. And you also had elites undertaking things like jurisdictional arbitrage and elite extraction internally. Colonialism offered opportunities for intermediaries to profit for differences between colonial European derived legal systems and existing local laws. Anthropologist Elizabeth Colson has noted how internal contestation played out in the development of customary land law, particularly in contexts where scarcity became a factor and people became aware of the conflicts between the old political obligation to maintain general access to adequate resources for all citizens and the possibility of extracting an individual profit from areas preempted under the rule that a man might enjoy the fruits of his labor. So I'm almost done. So we have these conflicts between systems, and internally individuals were permitted to extract, and the colonial authorities knew about it, but they didn't do anything about it. So you have this internal elite that was developed to take advantage of jurisdictional arbitrage and an assumption of entitlement to things that should be for the benefit of the whole society. But that assumption of entitlement has led to questionable incentives. It has led to questionable incentives that weren't sufficiently checked during colonialism and that are baked in institutionally and continue to the present day. Corruption is just one element of that. There's also an assumption of entitlement to resources that I think is one of the key things that has to be dealt with to disrupt colonial overhang. The bottom line, combined internal and external factors, have led to widespread poverty, precarity, and pervasive scarcity of opportunity, particularly for many young people. And what I argue in the book, in many African contexts, is tinder that's already burning in some places. I think if you look at the Arab Spring, we could debate the meaning of the Arab Spring, but the start of the Arab Spring was a Tunisian fruit seller setting himself on fire. And I think that was very unpredictable. I don't think anyone would have ever said that would happen. I think there are many, many potential hotspots in many African countries. So the key thing today is the need for strategies and approaches that reflect deep understanding of both the global and the local, and navigating difficult external and internal challenges. So today, many African countries have relationships with more than their former colonizers. We have China, we have India, we have Russia, all of whom we have people from the Gulf states, all of whom are interfacing, and many of whom are taking advantage of these institutions that were set up during colonialism that were extractive in orientation, both for internal and external parties. And that has to be disrupted to give opportunities to the young. Technology in African context today underscores a widening intergenerational gap. Africa has the oldest rulers and youngest population in the world. And that's a bad combination today, because the old rulers often don't understand technology except in authoritative terms. How can I shut down the internet, rather than how can I utilize technology to create opportunities for the young? And in most African contexts, there are not many opportunities for the young. South Africa and Nigeria, for instance, have youth unemployment rates of over 50%. And that's not atypical in many African contexts. So I'll end by saying, I think we need to think about what are the key values for disrupting this past legacy. And I see 4 key values. One is celebrating and using diversity within African contexts as a source of strength, rather than a source of continuing divide and rule. Thinking about sustainability, because the colonial rule was not, sustainability just wasn't an issue. It was built on a colonial railroad model. Let's build a railroad from mine to port, and let's even bypass cities along the way that actually we might want, if we're building a country, we might actually want to have transportation in those cities. There needs to be a focus on measurement and transparency. Many things are not measured. In Nigeria, for instance, it's not clear what the population is. So we need to think about how do we measure outcomes, how do we evaluate outcomes. We need flexible approaches. We need models and implementation that disrupt the tendency to valorize things that come from the outside. Focus on patterns of communication, and also attention to hybrid tools for conflict management. Because one thing that the civilization that was brought by colonialism didn't bring was actually conflict resolution. It actually brought a lot of divide and rule, and what conflict resolution mechanisms were there were often disrupted. And so I'm going to end there. I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Wow. I could take 3 hours with my questions, but I'll do that at dinner. So I will turn it over to you, and let's just go through. And if each of you take 5 to 7 minutes, let's say, to just think through, just your reactions from the book, from the reading, and most importantly, I think how it relates to your own work, which I think in everyone's case is very closely. I think we'd all be very excited to hear that. Would you mind doing it from the podium? Just so
Professor is gonna go.
Oh, okay. You want to? Okay. I wanted. Okay, that's great. No, that's perfect. Just go in the order we had listed. Sure.
So am I on?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So
It's good.
let me try this and see how it works before I continue. Just a minute, please. All right. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to share my screen here, and it's um, technology. Okay, let me do that again. See if it works. Ah, great. Sorry about that. Okay, so I want to thank Funmi Arewa for her book. This is a very extraordinary book, and it's reading it has sort of brought me face to face with um, some of the work I've been doing, which have been, issues that I've been struggling with, have been sort of put in very clear terms. And I kind of realized this is something that needed to have been done quite a while ago. And somebody with the kind of background she has given us a book like this, which will be a foundation for a lot of work for what we have to do generally. I'm using this title for the city yet to come, and this is from a book by Abdul Malik Simon, published by Duke in 2004. And I think, it's a title that's useful for thinking about a book like Disrupting Africa, which looks at how technology, law, and development can be used, to unravel some colonial heritage and point the continent in a new path. I asked to share screen so that I can show you this image. Um, and this is a work by Samuel Fossel, which is titled Le Chef, or the Chief Who Sold Africa to Europeans. I think this is a very pertinent image because it points to the collusion of Africa's elites with the structures of, bad governance and underdevelopment that has kept the continent, Africa is not a country, kept the continent in a state of significant, problems even long after the colonial period. But one of the things that Arewa does in her book that's really very useful for me is she points out how colonial overhang is something we still have to deal with. I've been involved in discussions with people, especially here on this side of the world, who say, look, colonialism ended 70 years ago. Why can't Africa get its act together? And I kind of see how this book presents a devastating account of how inherited colonial policies, shape unstable and predatory modes of governance in post-colonial African states. My contribution to this discussion, in terms of looking at her book, uh, approaches this from the impact of this colonial overhang on issues of art and its discourses, past and present. And I was very happy to see that she mentions things like, the repatriation and restitution issues in her discussion. Understanding the totality of all these inherited colonial problems is a very significant, place to begin with in trying to understand how to resolve some of the issues. In my own work, I've looked at these issues and, as I said, the impact they have on knowledge production. For example, African collectors who collect African artworks are written out of the discourse of African art history. This book that I'm showing you on the screen here is the first publication that was able to actually look at an African collection based in Africa and, evaluate what it means to a notion of representing African art in Western contexts that have lasted now for almost 120 years, where there are no single African collectors included in the many collections of African art that are shown globally. What this means is, of course, that the fact that Africans actually invest in their own cultural context is undervalued in our discussions of that cultural context. And that involves things like, these Benin bronzes that we're discussing, which constitute some of the best known hoard of African art that were that were taken away during the colonial period. There are examples of Benin artworks that are in African collections and in personal family collections. Like my family has some artworks from this Benin era that are not validated in the discourse because they have not passed through a museum, a European museum, or been collected by a European collector. My book on Ben and Wanwu brought that discussion. This is essentially how is value created for African cultural production. And my book on Ben and Wanwu brought that to contemporary art by looking at how an artist who was one of the most famous artists in the world between 1950 and 1960 all of a sudden disappears from art historical discourse. Before I published this book on Ben and Wanwu, auction houses were selling his works for $400 for a sculpture. And one was making £500 for a sculpture in 1946 when he was a student at Oxford University. But in 1997, 2000, they were selling his sculptures, for $400, which means that the value of his work actually plummeted after his death. When the book was published, the value of his work started to go up, and now he's one of the most highly coveted artists, from Africa. Basically, providing knowledge about this individual helped to enhance the value of his cultural production. And on Nollywood, of which has been mentioned in the introduction, Nollywood Rising, which I organized in 2005, is the first conference here in the United States to focus attention on the Nollywood industry. And the impact of that, of course, has been very significant because now we see Nollywood on Netflix, we see Nollywood movies on Netflix constantly. I don't want to reiterate the number of years I spent negotiating with American production companies and streaming companies, to include Nollywood movies in their arsenal. So the whole point of this is to point out that Arewa's book presents a devastating account of how inherited colonial policies shaped unstable and predatory modes of governance in post-colonial African states. A key point of Disrupting Africa is that the governance we see in Africa is as much a function of colonial predatory exploitation, which is reflected in the avarice of Africa's post-colonial rulers. Colonial protocols of centralized power, externally oriented infrastructure, overwhelming military brutality, and other factors have been imported wholesale and continue to plague post-colonial African countries. As such, the book concludes that development in Nigeria and other former colonies in Africa will require freedom from the legacy of colonial overhang and colonial institutional design that remains a vital force even long after the end of colonialism. And the prescriptions and suggestions that she provides in her book are very, very interesting and very useful. And I'm sure that if applied assiduously, many of them will have very good outcomes. But the question that I pose to the book is, how will all this be achieved? Africa is already locked into a global order that actively works against its development in collusion with local elites. And that's the whole point of the Fosso photograph. That this happened in the pre-colonial times. It was African elites who were selling Africans into slavery, and African elites have continued, to use the kind of extractive and avaricious accumulation that was a function of colonialism to impoverish their country. I mean, the example of the Nguema family's fortunes and the Angolan crisis of looting national treasuries. All this is to read about this continues for me to be just heartbreaking, because you see how in a country of 1 million people, the amount of money that Equatorial Guinea made, the Nguemas have squandered, would have been enough to turn that country into a mini Dubai. Dubai did it. In 40 years, Dubai went from a pearl fishing village, and became one of the flashiest megalopolis on the planet. This money was there. It's the inability to put this money to the kind of use that was needed is what's causing all these countries to remain poor. So if Africa is locked into this global order that works against its development, how are we going to get out of it? I'm glad that in her speech she mentioned the Ukraine crisis, and I want to sort of use that to point out, the first thing that the Western governments did when this crisis began, and I'm not taking sides on Russia's invasion or anything of that sort, just to point out a key issue, was that they cut Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. When the US invaded Iraq, the first thing they did was to cut Iraq off the internet. If we're proposing digital technologies for advancing Africa's cause in the future, What are we going to do when an African country falls afoul of the US and then gets cut off these international systems? So I kind of wish to propose that even though we like to talk about post-colonialism in Africa, Africa has not become post-colonial. You know, the colonial systems of management and governance are still very much in place, but now they've been sort of framed under neoliberal capitalism. We're talking about an advanced form of colonization, in essence, that is no longer escapable. You can't fight your way out of this, by taking up arms. Literally, you can't carry out a kind of Nkoto Sizwe ANC insurgency to try and get your freedom from this kind of system. It's a function of what Bob Marley called mental slavery. How do you get out of this? So I think we need to really be very much aware of that as we are thinking about these issues. Foreign governments collude, with African elites in African corruption because it's profitable for them. They are able to seize assets, that are looted by these individuals for use by their own governments. Western governments seized, hundreds of billions of dollars from Russia, and we have, for the first time in modern history, something really terrifying going on right now in relation to that Ukraine war. The assets of private citizens of a country that is not at war with the US are being seized in the US and in Europe, just supposedly because they come from the country, from a country whose leader is engaged in military action against another country. This is not something that we can look at and then imagine is not a problem. What I'm trying to say, in other words, is foreign governments collude in African corruption. Switzerland is being a very big benefactor of the billions of dollars looted from Africa. When the individuals who loot this money die or pass away, their money becomes locked down, and France went to court to argue for its right to seize money from the Nguema government. I mean, these are things that are happening and are being documented very clearly. The designation blood diamond, for instance, which has been used as a way of cutting off African resources from global market platforms, is a very clever way. All of these kinds of things are endorsed by the international organizations, the UN and others, right? De Beers diamond is being sold everywhere. Nobody has labeled De Beers diamond as slavery diamonds, even though De Beers basically use practice in South Africa for mining diamonds that are as close to slavery as you can get. So there is something very problematic going on here, and I think it's in thinking about these issues and pointing to the assumption that underlies our efforts to come up with solutions to these problems, which is an assumption of an even level playing field. So I think that the book did a very good job of pointing out how policies by colonial governments have bled over into the contemporary era and continue to hamper Africans. But I think it was not very, it needs to be very much more highlighted how those policies constrain the ability of countries, to act in a way that protects their own interests. The oil tragedies and spills in the Ogoni region, in the Niger Delta, would not continue, if the British government actually sanctioned Shell oil, or if the Dutch government sanctioned Shell oil for environmental practices, which, if they did in Holland or the UK, would cause, atrocious fines to be imposed upon the company. So this is racial capitalism. It's exactly what it means, and an understanding that the playing field is not level and that the decks are stacked against the African continent is something that needs to be part of our discussion. In saying this, I'm not excusing African elites and rulers and Africans themselves from their own participation in this process of self mismanagement, as it were. But we need to recognize that if we are pointing to colonialism as something that still has an overhang at this point in time, we definitely need to understand that the playing field in which we're operating is not a level playing field. So I thank Professor Arewa very much for for putting this book together. I've been waiting for a book like this because it sums up very nicely, some of the harsher realities of our day-to-day existence. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to make these few comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Can you hear me? I think you can hear me. thank you.
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, that was really, really amazing. And now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Al-Bulushi, and here are some of the comparisons perhaps seen from the southern part of Sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for the introduction. I also want to thank Tiffany Willoughby-Herrard for the invitation. She always has a good sense of how to bring people together on this campus, and it's an honor to be in conversation with these folks here today. And thanks, Jenny, as well, for all of the organizing efforts behind the scene and sending us really detailed documents about what was expected. It's really helpful. And thank you to Professor Funmi Arewa. We were talking earlier about how sad we are that she's no longer here at UCI. I can especially say that because we crossed paths. I think she left right before I arrived in 2018, but these are the kinds of conversations that I certainly look forward to. So it's still nonetheless an honor to be here and be a part of this conversation. Funmi Arewa's book, Disrupting Africa, Technology, Law, and Development, is a sweeping contribution to continental and global debates regarding the ongoing legacy of colonial rule, the precarious nature of contemporary institutions of governance. Maybe I'll take off my mask so you can hear me a little better. And the important role played by technology and development as two crucial sites of contemporary contestation and disruption in African states and societies. As she puts it in the preface, a key aim of the book is to, quote, examine laws, regulations, and law and policy making processes during colonialism in order to understand the continuing impact of pre-colonial and colonial policies and processes today. To this emphasis upon the ongoing impact of colonialism in the present, she adds a future-oriented focus on the horizons of the possible and of the potential that many different forms of disruption discussed in the book hold for our as yet unfulfilled freedom dreams. I particularly enjoyed how Dr. Arewa places her discussion of state-level processes and institutions, such as the law, development, and colonialism and its legacy, alongside an acute attention to popular people's movements like Mosa, the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, and SARS, as she mentioned earlier, reactionary movements like Boko Haram, as well as everyday people's use of technologies as forms of disruption. It's rare to see combined in a single study attention to both state processes from above and people's movements and everyday life from below. It's this dual lens that I think captures the complexity of how law, development, and technology are negotiated and transformed in Africa and throughout the world. Throughout the book, she engages an impressive array of interdisciplinary literature in order to stitch together her arguments. I would like to focus my remarks on some of the big reference points she makes to important thinkers of development, Africa, and colonialism. Specifically, I would ideally like to touch on her conversations with James Scott, Mahmoud Mamdani, and Achille Mbembe, but for purposes of time, I will restrict myself just to the brief conversation with Mbembe. I find these thinkers to be productive for thinking through tensions in how we understand the internal and the external, and I'd like to use them as a basis to ask Dr. Arewa one or two follow-up questions after having read this impressive text. In the introduction to the book, Colonialism and Africa's Future Past, she cites a quote from Achille Mbembe's On the Post-Colony, in which Mbembe is keen to break down the modern conceptual barriers that separate African space from non-African space. He states, quote, dealing with African society's historicity requires more than simply giving an account of what occurs on the continent itself at the interface between the working of internal forces and the working of international actors. Building on this quote, Arewa is keen to draw our attention to the long-standing and pre-colonial forms of interconnection among societies within Africa and between Africa and the world. Examples of these ties across space that she cites include West African kingdoms, North Africa's connections to the Mediterranean world, the trans-Sahara trade, Indian Ocean circuits based on monsoon winds, and the diffusion of Bantu languages across the African continent. My first question, therefore, concerns the conceptual framework that offers a really useful thread throughout the book in its focus on external and internal processes. Is Mbembe pushing us to think about precisely the forms of interconnection and mutual constitution beyond the binary of inside and outside, the colonizer and the colonized, without, of course, in any way neglecting the ongoing nature of external influences. As we think through the ongoing coloniality of power as it applies to Africa in the present, to what extent is the geographical imagination at play in our thinking forced to grapple with intertwined forms of power that begin to break down a clearly demarcated inside and outside to Africa at times? I ask this in part because I think Arewa offers us some really useful examples in the book of the limits of a certain anti-colonial discourse when it's deployed in our global era. She tells the story of a recently elected Nelson Mandela trying to hold the Nigerian government accountable for the execution of environmental activists from the movement for the survival of the Ngoni people. When Mandela tries to appeal to Commonwealth countries to condemn General Abacha's actions, he's criticized by fellow African states for trafficking in colonial discourses that risk reproducing a paternalistic condemnation of Africa from the outside. And he's reminded of Nigeria's contributions to the anti-apartheid struggle. So how are we to understand the legacy of colonialism, the internal and external, in situations such as these, which so clearly perpetuate authoritarian rule and facilitate brutal attacks on contemporary liberation struggles, such as Mossad? For his part, Mbembe builds on these themes of interconnection as well in his recently translated book, Out of the Dark Night, Essays on Decolonization. There he elaborates a theory of Afropolitanism that I think represents his attempt to think through our current moment, which he refers to as, quote, the unprecedented opening of African societies to the world, and the increasingly complex African migration patterns leading to a plethora of diasporas, all of which require us to go beyond conceptual binaries of inside and outside without abandoning the need to theorize and develop forms of praxis related to decolonization in the present. In this book, he also interestingly takes up the debate regarding the repatriation of African art from places like France and Germany to the continent, in a discussion that I think dovetails really nicely with Arewa's analysis regarding how to deal with the legacies of colonialism in the present, which it turns out for Mbembe don't have any easy answers. He somewhat surprisingly seems to imply either a refusal of repatriation or perhaps the impossibility of genuine repatriation. As Arewa points out, the stakes of these debates are high. She states, quote, contestation about looting and repatriation are part of a continuing dialogue about the past, present, and future, and draws attention to patterns of involvement of the external in Africa. In Out of the Dark Night, Mbembe certainly concurs, asking, is Europe finally ready to embark on the path toward destinations that are still to come? Or is it no longer anything other than the pure event of a fissure, a thing split in pure loss without depth or perspective? And then Mbembe warns us, so that the restitution of African objects, he says, does not become an occasion for Europe to buy itself a good conscience at a cheap price. The debate must be recentered around the historical, philosophical, anthropological, and political stakes of the act of restitution. One then sees that every authentic politics of restitution is inseparable from a capacity for truth, such that honoring truth and acts of repairing the world become, by the same token, the essential foundation of a new connection and a new relationship. In its focus on a dialectic of external and internal relations across questions of law, technology, and development, Disrupting Africa offers us precisely such an opportunity to take up Mbembe's question of the possibility of new connections across time and space in the future. Thank you. So much. Mr. Millward.
Good afternoon. So, like everyone else, I would like to thank
among many people. I would like to thank Dr. Timmy Willoughby-Harari for thinking of this and bringing it to full execution. I would like to thank, of course, Jenny, who it literally could not be done without you. And certainly the brilliance of Dr. Arewa for doing the work. I will try to keep my comments to 7 minutes. I timed it at 8. Dr. Mark, please don't cut me off. But I'll try to keep it at 7 minutes. So as an early American, as someone who does Africa, early African America, as a scholar of slavery in the diaspora, and really as I'm finding myself now as a kind of quasi expat with a husband and kids in Ghana, I kind of came to your study with both the intellectual and research knowledge of how we are haunted by truths of the past and both of the present. I thought incredibly about the arguments you make about, I'm sorry, I shouldn't just say you're so close. There was arguments about internal and external conflicts. And I was also fully conscious of Africa's uneven development despite the continuance of the intellectual wealth of the continent. Okay, so I found particular interest in disrupting Africa precisely because it is in part of these conversations that I call haunting technologies, you would call colonial overhang. And one of the groupings of haunting technologies I would see then would be slavery, US colonialism, obviously, and progress, but also the ways in which particularly as we talk about colonial overhang, the role of how digital spaces and access to digital platforms parallels other moments of, as the author points out, pillaging for art, for minerals, for people. Also the ways in which spaces and movement, whether it be a railroad or dirt roads, also contribute to economic advancement and or disenfranchisement all at the same time. So I loved the book talked about the digital divide and what I see as both digital humanities, how we understand stories, how we record stories, how we now record histories, the difference between Black digital humanities that comes with a reparative justice type component. I don't know if you realized you were doing that or not, but the book was doing that. And also looking at the ways in which national and world structures, infrastructures impact kind of digital divide, digital access, and digital education. I do have some students here from my comparative slave rebellion course, and so I want them to, they heard you, but I want to repeat what I appreciated both of your comments and other things I read is this slave Bible and how rebellious notions were written out of the slave Bible. We just talked about Nat Turner's Bible, and I just wonder, I have to wonder, what was written in his Bible and what he might have been channeling. So I just wanted to make sure, in case you missed it, I want to make sure you think about it some more, about the way in which Christianity in particular can be written to both developed civilizations and dissolved civilizations, if we take the work of Dr. Arewa seriously. So I would like to spend most of my time talking about ghosts, apparitions, specters, both real, digital, imagined, present, temporal, corporeal, non-linear, recoverable, and all those that also still like to stay hidden. And I say this with a metaphor to looking at the way in which Arewa's work talks about colonial overhang, because is a colonial overhang just a way in which we understand the ghosts of colonialism and the persistence of these ghosts. So the author sees what many of us sometimes forget to see or need to re-see. In particular, I want to think about the ways in which the technologies of death work, both as an implicit conversation in her work and also an explicit. When we think about we weren't supposed to read the final chapter, but I did. When we think about the final chapter of the global pandemic, when we think about the year of 2020 and this moment when the world suddenly realized that Black Lives Matter And the way in which we can no longer talk about history, politics, lived experiences, or politics for people of African descent the same way, because the rest of the world now, in theory, believes what we've known long to be true. Because of this time, I want to point out just a few things in this conversation about ghosts and spirits. And that is the ghost stories that Dr. Arewa speaks about. And not just what remains in terms of going to art galleries and asking for the return or demanding the return or walking out with the artifacts and really hastening a conversation about the return of artifacts. But what does it mean to return to Africa? What does it mean to return narratives of return to Africa? And I think about the enslaved period, we think about Cinque and the Amistad Rebellion, who they overthrow enslavers aboard their ship, they come to trial in the US, and it's ordered that they are allowed to return back home, only to find their civilization and their family members gone in Sierra Leone. What does it mean to return to Africa with the sense of Pan-Africanism, right? Looking at the ghosts of the 1960s and 70s, and literally when you go to Ghana, W.B. Du Bois on your shoulder. What does it mean then to have like a return movement of people who may not be literally from that particular country? But I also want to think about the actual returning, not just of artifacts, but the returning of actual remains. The remains of Sarah Bartman that was returned to South Africa. The work of Ebony, I always say her last name wrong, Ebony Kolotu, who talks about the returning the remains of her ancestor to Ghana, an ancestor she did not know about. Or the work of Rachel Engman, who is working at Christenberg Castle in Osu and working with descendants of Osu Castle, both who were working and enslaved in the castle and those who governed the castles. So what does it mean to bring not just artifacts back, but actual remains? And remains also in the sense of this new topic, not a new technology of recovery, which is DNA evidence. We know that during the pandemic, people had so much time to do family history. And because people are doing more and more family history, either through Ancestry.com or through 33andMe or African Ancestry, we know that the actual pool of DNA that people can pull from is changing by the moment. The more people that come into the pool, the more connections are made and the ways in which your own family history can change. But what does it mean for ghosts and the work of healing recovery to return to a country where you might have a DNA connection? And I'm speaking primarily for people from the diaspora who don't know what their actual, or probably don't know what their actual African lineage is. Colonial overhang, this ghost, I'm still on this ghost and I'm thinking about law. What really intrigued me about your chapter was law, because it goes so unspoken that many African countries are still practicing within the framework of British law, right? There, I see no difference between the property law indentures I read for colonial America and what I'm reading as I'm working through my own indenture in Ghana. And I will say this, we've talked about Nat Turner, we've talked about the Slave Bible. I want to go back to 2020. It's interesting because prior to 2020, I would have approached disrupting Africa a bit differently. But timing is everything, and there are no accidents, even in publishing. The publication date of 2021 allowed this book to bear witness to a particular moment where really not just the world we know was changing, but also the world and how we recall these ghosts, how we recall what we know was changing in that moment, right? I mean, for those people that you need to say more plainly, for the first time, Americans had to look at their own vulnerability. A pandemic had hit American shores. And we were forced to help ourselves. And we're still dealing with that. We were not supposed to speak on the final chapter, but I did, because it was great. This was a great chapter. And I believe what you do here is crucial for realizing an Africa Futures or Africa Futures. And there's a focus on a dancer Anthony Mensoma Madu from Leap Dance Academy of Lagos, Dancing in the Rain. And this act of dancing in the rain is both fact and metaphor. I think of people who also want to dream a new Africa future, like Tete Yarte and the Noyam Dance Company in Ghana. I think about people who have now with worldwide access to places they never would have thought about visiting, save for a pandemic that had them tied to their computer and Zoom. Now they can contribute to educational and artistic institutions on the continent, because they also are haunted by a ghost, though they might not realize it. One can communicate to anywhere in the world, WhatsApp, photo phones, however you want to say it, within whatever technology you want to use within the continent, but we know that they are still haunted by the ghosts of rolling blackouts, inefficient computer stations at educational institutions. And when educational access is not hindered by technology, the intellectual genius, the advancements of individuals and leaders are not regularly discussed in a way that makes modern Africa legible to the world. Because you start talking about the ways in which Africa is not legible. And I will leave with this. I will end my conversation about ghosts and colonial overhang, which with the power of this work, to disrupt Africa, to play on its name itself. The power of this work lies in interrogating the continual structural inequity facing Africa, both in our memory and in our dreams for the future. And in doing so, by calling attention and pushing for this type of interrogation, perhaps if the ghosts haunting the continent and our collective reality can find rest.
Thank you, Professor Millward. I think maybe as much time, 10, 15 minutes to reply to some of these comments, and then we will have some time.
I'll be shorter. The comments were all fantastic. I entirely agree with Sylvester that African countries are locked in it's not entirely a straitjacket, but there's significant external constraints that many African countries face today. I would argue, so I entirely acknowledge that. I think I was talking to actually Olu in Germany, and he was saying, steering the ship of Germany is like steering the Titanic. It's hard, unless you find an iceberg somewhere, nothing is gonna drastically go wrong. I would not want to be a leader of any country in Africa today, because the managing this colonial overhang is just incredibly difficult, even if you have the best interests and that you really want to help the majority of the population. You're so constrained externally by the power array of constellation of forces, and you're so constrained internally by what's been done before, and you can't disrupt it all at once. So where do you start? I think it's a real challenge. So navigating in African countries today is very difficult. That said, I think there are very few countries that actually have a strategy. So it does require a sustained strategy that persists from government to government. One of my favorite stories is that there was a point where I would go to Nigeria 2 or 3 times every year. And this was over the course of like 10 years. And at one point I asked, well, this freeway that's being built, why isn't it done? It's being built by a German company, why isn't it done? And it was explained to me, well, that was awarded under the old government. And the new government doesn't want to allocate money to finish this road because they're not going to get any part of it. So there's a problem of sustained strategy, and this goes back to some of the colonial overhang I talked about. So I think there has to be a view of we're going to manage as well as we can within these external constraints. We're not even close to that in almost any country in Africa today. We're managing to the best possible ability within those external constraints. That said, I think the constraints may be changing, because if you look at the discussion of migration in Europe, where the Africans that are migrating from Africa, they don't come to the US, they're coming to Europe because that's the closest, and many people are dying tragically in the Mediterranean. But there was an interesting discussion I talk about in the book between an Italian government official and France. And granted, this was an anti-immigrant party, but the guy said, the reason we're getting all these immigrants, and Italy's getting hit before France, because Italy sticks down very far, it's very close to Africa. And he said it's because of French colonial policies. And so I think there's increasing recognition that this colonial overhang is shaping the landscape of opportunities within Africa. And it's part of what's driving people to cross the Sahara. I mean, imagine you're in Nigeria, you decide to cross the Sahara, brave the slave markets in Libya where people are being sold as slaves, and cross the Mediterranean, and to just try to get an opportunity. And I think that hopefully part of the argument should be from an external external power perspective. In the past, they just didn't really care what happened internally in African countries. It didn't impact them. But I think increasingly, because of things like radical movements, it could be, it's not just Islamists, there are all kinds of radical movements in African countries, part of which are a response to a lack of opportunity and migration. They're now saying, well, actually, this does impact us. So there's a part where you can appeal to their selfishness and say, you know, you have to care what's happening internally because it's not going to stay internal today. It's going to shape other parts of the world. And I think that's the best argument for a constellation of getting internal and external alignment. Now, for people internally, many of them have one foot outside, like they're external facing in many respects, but it's harder to get out today. It's not like the 1960s and 70s where almost anyone could migrate. The migration, ability to migrate is closing down. And we also have things in the last 5 years, we've had Ebola crisis, we've had COVID. So you can't actually assume you can easily get out. And I think that's one of the best ways to appeal to people internally, is that the world is changing and it's not going to be so easy to get out, even if you have money, because with COVID, people couldn't escape. If you during COVID times, you were stuck in whatever country you're in. During Ebola, if you were one of the countries impacted by Ebola, you were stuck where you were. And I think internally, so you can have an appeal to people to say things are changing, so maybe you need to change a little bit with it. Because otherwise, I think we're on a path to catastrophe, given the demographics that we're seeing. When you have a doubling of the youth population between now and 2050, if not the end of the century, I think the path is pretty catastrophic, even in the countries that are most developed, like South Africa. And the demographics there are truly startling. Just a couple of other comments. I entirely agree with Professor Milward about ghosts. I talk a little bit about ghosts. I think whatever conceptually can help you understand what's going on, it can be overhang, it can be ghosts. I think they all refer to the same thing in my view. In terms of legacies of colonialism, I agree with Professor Al-Bulushi. I think of internal and external as a mechanism to enhance understanding. And it explains some of what's on the ground, but what's on the ground is much more complicated. It's not as simple as internal and external. I think I use it as a tool, but it's important to note internal and external is always shifting. And like elites who are partly internal and external, what are they? I mean, they aren't entirely internal. Many of them have houses. I mean, one of the things people do when they accumulate is it's not just Russians who are buying houses in London, it's many Nigerians and many other people that are buying houses in London. So even that kind of external accumulation is a fascinating phenomenon in and of itself, in the United States as well. So I think internal and external are a way to enhance understanding, but it's not 100% representative. This picture on the ground is actually much more complicated. So I entirely agree with all those comments, and I think they were fantastic. And last comment, I think part of this book speaks to the idea that law, unlike other areas, there's an assumption you could just move laws around and you can move them out of cultural contexts. And I think law is too important to leave to the lawyers. And I think it's really important to have an understanding that that doesn't work. There's almost no place where that's worked. Almost every place where that's been done, except settler colonies is the one example. And you can argue that even in settler colonies, it hasn't really worked. In the United States, we could, especially after BLM and George Floyd, there's an increasing discussion about how we think our system works is not really how it works. And that's a problem with translating laws to other contexts. Everyone says, my law is great, let's just use my law. But most people don't understand how the laws work. And if they do, they often are, we as lawyers are trained in certain ways and we're trained to make it work. Whether it really works or not, that's another question. So I think we always have to continually integrate whenever we're borrowing things. Borrowing is great. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. But you have to really question how you're borrowing and whether it really works. So I'll leave it at that, but fantastic comments. Thank you all very much. And I also want to say, I didn't thank Jenny.
Yeah.
In addition to Tiffany, this wouldn't have been possible without Jenny. So we should also
I'd like to know if any of you three, also online, have any responses to her response. Otherwise, we'll open it up to both the people here and also anyone online who would like to ask a question.
I have kind of a brief question, just in terms of what you were saying, which I found so useful. One of the many strengths of the book is bringing together the kind of approach of political economy with such an acute tension to questions of culture. And I'm curious, and I think what you just said also dovetails nicely with what Professor Ogbechie was saying about racial capitalism as undergirding a lot of this colonial overhang. Not being a legal scholar or knowing much about legal scholarship, but recently having come across a special issue of the South Atlantic Quarterly on law and capitalism that seems to be arguing that there is a shift within legal scholarship to pay more attention to law and political economy. I think there's a center at Yale Law School that focuses on this, and they're kind of bringing capitalism back into the center of their discussions of the law. I'm curious if part of what, at least what I took Professor Ogbechie kind of to be gesturing towards was this question of the relationship between the colonial overhang and racial capitalism. And if we bring these frameworks together in the analysis, what that does and what it does to also our kind of geographical imagination. Because also my point was not at all that internal, external is not a useful metaphor. I think it's so useful for all the reasons you laid out and Professor Ogbechie laid out and that Professor Milward laid out. Like, we're stuck, you know, so much of what we're dealing with is direct legacy from colonial rule, and there is a kind of geographical containment to Africa and ongoing colonial processes, but there are also all these other things going on. And so how does one take into consideration the changing role of elites that you mentioned and that was mentioned earlier? Could the kind of coupling the overhang of colonialism with a racial capitalist framework help us get there? Is that kind of part of law and political economy? I don't know, you know, these are just additional questions that I have.
Yeah, that's an interesting pairing with Professor Ogbechie's comment. I think it only gets us partly there, because I think in reality, we're only partly talking about race. Because I remember a conversation I once had with someone from Kenya, and he said, you know, in Kenya, there are people we refer to as the Black colonialists. And, you know, that's where the intermediation of internal elites, it gets a lot more complicated. I think at its heart, there's a racial hierarchy that colonialism was based on. And that was implemented, but there was an idea, and this comes through in the colonial records to a significant degree, that elites were somewhere in between. And sometimes elites were not really thought of as being natives. And, you know, there are all these categories that were never really defined. Colonialism was implemented based on race, essentially the laws were implemented based on race. They didn't really have conflicts of law. They just had an idea that, first of all, Black people shouldn't have equal oversight over white people. And they had problems with all these categories. Like there were these discussions of Syrians in the documents. They didn't know what to do with Syrians because what are they exactly? And you could tell that there was this binary conception of race that didn't really fit in with what was actually present on the ground. And there was also this problem of the internal elite. So sometimes they were separated from the category of native. So maybe we could think about it as racialized capitalism, but it wasn't entirely race-based because different categories fit in varying ways. And I think it was somewhat contextual because one of the things that the book Ghosts of Empire talks about is colonialism was very ad hoc. So they just did what they felt like. And, you know, in their comments, you could see they had crazy ideas. They clearly had crazy ideas about race. I mean, we'll start out. So, you know, there was a big racial component. But I think racialized capitalism might be, I think, a better way to think about it because it wasn't entirely race-based because there was some permeability in categories.
I wanted to drop in there and just say, while racialized capitalism might be a good way to think about it, racial capitalism is actually more apt because yes, it was race-based. What you're describing is accommodations made to what we might term as collaborators, you know, within the system of exploitation. And it's the same thing you had in South Africa where, you know, blacks from other countries visiting South Africa during apartheid were termed honorary whites, you know. So that doesn't stop them being black. It just means that within the system of recognition and legalism in South Africa, they could, within constraints, you know, not be subjected to the same kind of problematics that the citizens themselves, the South African blacks were encountering. So you can look at that same thing within racism, where the color line, you know, has been used as a way to sow dissent between various populations of blacks by favoring, you know, lighter-skinned blacks over darker-skinned blacks during the period of slavery. So, you know, whether that favoring is there or not, to consider that to be anything other than racial capitalism is to assume that there is some kind of advantage that accrues to, you know, to the person on the receiving side of that quote unquote privilege, which is a privilege that's temporary at best. It can be revoked easily. It's not natural, in other words. So that privilege is not grounded in any kind of asserted rights. It's temporary and can be revoked.
Can I ask a question at this point, building on what Prof just said? Because if we can accept that capitalism is inherently colonial. I mean, it emerges out of colonialism and enslavement and genocide. I mean, those are the three engines of the modern world system in a way. And yet today we are in quote unquote post-colonial systems, which are still very much colonial, as we all know. We're in Africa, where race doesn't work the same way as it did when it was directly colonized, yet the functions that racial differentiation served still function to help concentrate wealth among very few people. Similar, of course, that's happening right here. It serves the same function. And yet we're also in a place where there's these new disruptive technologies. But are these technologies able to overcome the really powerful discursive and physical networks of power that have been created and defined for hundreds of years through this kind of racialized colonialism, racialized capitalism, which is how all the flows of wealth were extracted, right, from these countries. So I wonder if this isn't the problem, is that we all hope technology, it's almost like technology was supposed to be, or the new technology was supposed to be like dropping acid or something to your brain, right? You do hallucinogenic and it opens up new pathways in your brain that didn't exist. And then suddenly maybe you can think in new ways and you won't be so rigid. That's why it's good for people with PTSD and other things who literally can't get out of the ruts that their minds are in. So in some ways, new technologies were supposed to be like hallucinogenic. They opened up new pathways for power, new pathways for wealth, new pathways for culture to pass through. And yet somehow these pathways seem to be co-opted or blocked or reshifted by the same forces that have always done so. In the end, Arab Spring, I was there for a lot of it. In Nigeria, I was there during NSARS, the same thing. So were we just too hopeful? And if that's true, even Fela, right? Even Fela, he was using new technologies of long playing albums to create these 30-minute songs that were, so violent against the government. The government just threw his mother out the window. That was their response.
She died.
And she died from it. And his response was to put the image of her coffin on his album.
Yeah, but then they put him in prison and smashed his trumpet. So,
So who wins, right? So I'm just wondering, like, in the end, does the idea, the fetishization of technology, like in Egypt, people were naming their babies Facebook after the revolution. They named their children Facebook because they thought Facebook saved them.
It didn't.
Right.
It's an illusion. It's an illusion of power, in essence, and that's the difference between the.
You're an artist. But as artists, then, if it's not technology, then what is it that artists can do, or what power do artists have if not utilizing the newest technology to actually still be able to shift people's perceptions, give them hope, give them a new way of resisting and creating communities against all these divisions?
I think technology is actually regressive. I think we tend to, in many respects. I think there's positives and negatives, and even if they're net positives, technology can still be a regressive force. Look at Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is actually much less diverse than the rest of business. We think of business as a change between 1950 and the emergence of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley companies are much more male. They're much less representative of even the broader American society.
And much more undemocratic and autocratic.
And they, Sacha Baron Cohen, who I quote in the book, he calls the Silicon Six, that basically have sway over the entire world. So there are 6 people that have so much control over the world. We've never seen that kind of concentration of power. We've never seen the kind of concentration of power that we see in technology companies that are bigger than most countries. If you look at the top 10 technology companies in the world, they are probably more powerful than any country in Africa.
Yeah.
And that concentration of power is corrupted. That kind of concentration of power is, and we also have lack of transparency, lack of understanding and accessibility of much of what they do to the.
Oh, it's like the East India
And,
Company.
and they look like,
It's
they
again-
put the anarchy,
Yeah.
which is really, I think, described it pretty well. It's like, I don't think we should assume that technology is a progressive force, even if net technology is beneficial. Because I think that's where you have to think of it from a political economy perspective, who are the winners and losers? And that there may be 90% of the population is a loser, but if you look at technology companies today, the amount of Mackenzie Scott, for instance, who's doing a wonderful job giving away billions of dollars to people, she's actually wealthier. She's become wealthier, even though she's given, I don't know, $20 billion away, or I don't know the right number. She's wealthier because she has so much capital that she got wealthier despite, she's gained more money than she's given away. And she's giving it away, many people aren't. So when we think about the accumulation of wealth that's been enabled in the technology era, the current digital economy, it's a problem for the world because it's American concentrated, it's English concentrated, it's people, if you look at the boards of all those companies, there are almost no one that's not based in the United States on the board of any of those companies, despite the fact that Facebook's audience is mostly outside of the US. And I wouldn't name myself Facebook. I mean, Facebook is a horrifying, it's controlled by one person who has control over.
Well, now so is Twitter, you know, and so that's the thing I wanted to point out here, that the function of technology has never been emancipation. The idea that technology emancipates was an illusion. Technology is co-opted by the powerful and by the ruling class always, you know, to serve nefarious ends. So here is the thing: all the digital technologies have imported the biases of the, you know, analog world, so that you know, we don't know what they are putting into these algorithms. I mean, they are creating new structures of the way I put it is, what's coming in front is going to be much worse than what came before. If we're thinking that slavery and colonialism was bad, you know, what's coming in front is going to be much worse than that, because it's just a situation that's going to lock people into a way where there is no escape whatsoever. You know, Elon Musk is coming for your head. What will happen when people start implanting chips in their head and somebody can hack into your head, you know, and hack into the chip in your head? I mean, there are things, sorry I sound so dystopian, but the point is,
Elon Musk is doing it.
I have looked at this for quite a while. The point I'm trying to make here is, if we understand the basic fact that, you know, those with control of greater capital will always be able to twist technology to their end, then we understand that technology has liberatory potentials, but we cannot depend on it, you know, to save anybody. Like she said, there has never been as much concentration of power as we now see in technology, you know, created situations. If between Facebook and Elon Musk and the owners of Google and Amazon, and, you know, we're talking about like 6 or 8 companies here that literally have a stranglehold over global resources. Think about BlackRock, for example. BlackRock owns the world. How many of you have heard of BlackRock? So these are the things that we need to really be bearing in mind. Do we have anybody in the audience who wants to ask a question, by the way?
Well, I was just gonna add a couple of comments. One is, I mean, one thing I really loved about Funmi's approach is it's not just the dystopian, but it's critical, but also keeping in mind this idea that there are alternative paths, that there are potentialities that we could try to pursue. Because I do think it's really kind of shuts things down if we only take the kind of Afro-pessimist view that the powerful control everything and there's, you know, everybody's in a straitjacket and there's no exit and, you know, we're under control. And in terms of technology, I mean, one reason African governments engage in internet shutdowns is because people do actually get some benefits from being able to organize and communicate independently of state organs and mainstream media. So I think we have to keep in mind the, you know, the contradictions, the double nature of so many things, that it can be oppressive and have, you know, liberating potentials at the same time. The other thing I wanted to mention, which is slightly on a tangent, if you'll forgive me for that, is I just came back from France. And one thing I saw there, which I think was really interesting, is I felt like, at least in France, I don't know if it's a trend more widespread in Europe, was that there was sort of a new opening to deal with the ghosts of the slave trade and colonialism in their, for them, for French society. And one, I mean, they're redoing the Museum of Immigration to include slavery. I mean, in some cases it's monuments and different things like that, but these are sort of public educational tools that are reminding people of some of these histories. And then one of the other interesting things I think that was going on that I observed is how they're borrowing from Black America. So in February, they celebrated Black History Month, in France. And a lecture I went to on like Africans and discrimination in France, it was largely explaining to French people a lot of ideas about the construction of race and different kinds of histories that are like taken for granted in the US today. So I think there's like some very interesting things, cultural things going on that could be, could have potential.
Any other questions or comments from the audience, either online or here in the room?
I just want to thank everyone for this amazing scholarship that you presented today. I'm a PhD student in the American Politics Department, so I'm familiar with a lot of these discussions, and just thank you so much. It was like a rich collection of information that was beautifully organized, and I appreciate you being here.
Thank you all for
Thanks for
coming.
coming.
Can I just close by, first of all, thanking again Tiffany Willoughby-Herard for organizing this. I'm so sorry you couldn't be here, but sending you all our and everyone from the bookstore and everyone who made it possible. In case you didn't know, you're not allowed to leave without buying a book.
Unless you're a student, which is.
Right, well then, then you could steal it. But please buy the book. Everyone who's watching and who's here, it is an amazing book, really gonna reshape a whole bunch of fields. And I hope we can do this more again, and I hope we can have you back. The weather is lovely. Philly's only gonna get hotter and more humid.
That's true.
So, and thank you, Prof, from all the way up in Santa Barbara. Hope to have you down here also soon. And, yeah, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. And please read the book and learn more about Africa.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Funmi, I'll contact you later and keep up the conversation. I hope you
Let's
don't
continue
mind.
the conversation. Loved your remarks. Thank
All
you.
right, bye.
Thanks for coming.
So for my students, I'll